So in order for us to understand, I'm just going to look quickly at this life cycles component that I've written. It's just called life cycles, right? That's all it is. It's just a component called life cycles, which is a class component extending the React component. So inside of here are the possible lifecycle methods that we want to look at. And inside of each one, I'm just logging the name of the lifecycle that it is so that when it gets called and we look in our console, we'll see the order in which they're getting fired. Now, before we take a look into what these lifecycles are, there's actually a diagram we can look at on the React website. And on this diagram, it will show us in this graph form when each method fires depending on what phase the component is in. So the first phase we're going to look at is the mounting phase. The mounting phase is the phase when the component is being put on the DOM for the first time. So when it's mounting, when it's in the mounting phase, it starts before our component is actually on our DOM, right? Before it's on our page. When it starts mounting, it first looks at the component. So for us, our life cycles component, and then it sees the constructor and it calls the constructor first. So inside of our constructor, we have our super, right? And the super is pretty much just a method on all classes inside of their constructors that say, if I'm extending from some other class component, I want to pull in all of their methods and all of their functionality, right? Which might sound complicated, but all you need to know is that what that does is it allows our class component to have access to these lifecycle components. Because you can see it as if these lifecycle components and when they get called and the order of all this functionality is actually originally bound to this React component, this React class component that we need to borrow from. So we're essentially saying, extend me all of that functionality into my class component called lifecycles. And then the constructor, when we call super, it's like, okay, this is when I want you to give me all that functionality, right? So that I can bind it all to my class component. Inside of the constructor as well is when we can declare our state, right? So when we call this .state, we do it inside of our constructor, specifically for this reason, because this is when our state becomes initialized on our class. So the constructor gets called first for this reason, so that our component's other lifecycle methods, if they need to use the state, are aware of the state because it's initialized inside of our constructor. After the constructor call, it then calls our render method. And the render method is when our component tells JavaScript, okay, this is what I want you to display in terms of HTML. This is also where any prop values get evaluated in the HTML. So because we're passing in that text string, this is when JavaScript's like, oh, I'm calling the render method on this class. I'm also going to evaluate the value of this props.text and then turn it into something that I can display in the HTML. And that's how we're able to see that string value that would get passed in as a prop, or anything for that matter. This evaluation is happening inside of our render call. After the render comes when React actually updates the DOM, right? Or it makes updates to our component. But the main thing here is where React's like, okay, now that I know what the component looks like because of the render, and I know what state and whatever things are on the class component because of the constructor, I'm now going to put it on the page. I'm going to mount it. And then once it mounts, the component did mount. Lifecycle method gets fired. And inside of here is where it's like, okay, the component has mounted. It's in its base state, right? It's properly evaluated. Then I'm going to call my lifecycle method component did mount. And if we look at our application, we'll see that that's the order that it happens. We get the constructor first, then the render gets called, and then our component did mount gets called. And usually this is where, after we've loaded our base bare class component, inside of our component did mount, is where we start to do things like our API calls. If you remember from our earlier instance, where we made an API call to get all the users for our Monsters Rolodex. And the reason for this is because we want to load the base component first before we start fetching data and updating our component so that it looks different from the base state, right? Because we don't know how long that API call might take. Latency might be slow. Your connection might be poor. But this is the order and how we should leverage this lifecycle method, is that we wait for the base component to mount, and then we're like, okay, let's use our component did mount method to update it into its next state. And this next state, this updating phase, is the next phase of our component, after the base mounted state is on our DOM. So let's take a look at the next phase, the updating phase.